The Nevada sun doesn't just shine. It punishes. It's a white, blinding weight that presses down on the sagebrush until wood turns to bone and the earth cracks like a parched throat. Silas Thorne didn't mind the heat. He'd spent 20 years in the cavalry and another 10 on this patch of dirt near Black Canyon, and he'd learned that the sun was the only thing in this world that was honest. It didn't lie about its intentions. Before we'll continue this beautiful story, folks, I want to take your time and hit subscribe button and tell me where you're listening the story from. I will keep my eyes on the comment. Now let's begin. Silas was a man of few words and even fewer visitors. He had a cabin built of cedar and sweat, a horse that knew his moods better than any person, and a Winchester rifle that stayed oiled and ready. He thought he'd seen everything the desert could throw at a man. He was wrong. It was late Tuesday, that hour when the shadows started to stretch out long and thin like fingers reaching for a drink. Silas was out by the north fence line, mending a section of wire that the wind had worried loose. That's when he saw the shape. At first, he thought it was a wounded antelope or maybe a mirage conjured by the heat, but it moved too heavy for a beast. It was human. She was crawling, not walking, not running, just dragging herself through the dust, her fingers clawing at the dirt. Silas dropped his pliers, the metal clinking against a stone. He didn't run. Men like Silas don't run unless there's a fire or a charge. But he moved with a purpose. As he got closer, the smell hit him. Not the smell of the trail, but the metallic tang of blood mixed with the sweet, sickening scent of infection. She was young, barely out of her teens, wearing a dress that might have been yellow once. Now it was the color of a bruise. Her hair was a tangled nest of straw and grit, hiding a face that was pale as a ghost in the moonlight. He reached for her shoulder, but she shied away like a kicked dog. She collapsed onto her side. She looked up then. Her eyes were green, but they were clouded with a pain so deep it looked like she was drowning in it. She shook her head, her knuckles turning white as she pulled her skirt down even harder, covering her legs completely. "Please," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rattle. Don't look at my legs." Silas frowned. He saw the way she was positioned. Her legs weren't just injured. They were stiff, as if they were made of lead. She wasn't just hiding wounds. She was hiding a secret that was killing her. Silas didn't ask questions. In the West, questions get you buried. Actions get you through the night. He scooped her up. She was heavier than she looked. Way heavier. It wasn't the weight of a person. It was a dead, cold weight that strained Silas's back. He carried her toward the cabin, the dust kicking up around his boots. Every step he took, he heard a strange, dull clinking sound coming from her dress, like stones in a leather pouch. Inside, the cabin was cool. It smelled of pine resin and old coffee. He laid her down on the long wooden table he'd built with his own 2 hands. She groaned, her eyes rolling back. But even in her semi-consciousness, her hand stayed locked on that skirt. "I gotta see to the wounds, girl," Silas said. He went to the stove and lit a small fire, putting the kettle on. He needed hot water. He needed to clean whatever mess was under that fabric before the rot took her whole. "No," she wheezed, her head thrashing on the wood. "They'll come. If they see, they'll kill us both." Silas fetched a clean cloth and his sharpest skinning knife. He sat on a stool beside her. He'd seen a lot of things in the war. He'd seen men try to hide their guts with their hands. He'd seen the way fear makes a person lie. But he'd never seen a girl this terrified of her own skin. "My name's Silas," he said, trying to soften the iron in his tone. "And out here, they don't own nothing. This is my land. The wind and the coyotes are the only ones who listen, and they don't talk back. You're safe." She looked at him for a long heartbeat. The flickering light of the hearth danced in her pupils. Slowly, her fingers uncurled. Her hands fell to her sides, limp and exhausted. Silas took a breath. He reached out against her shins and calves with leather thongs that had bitten deep into her muscle were bars. Small, rectangular bars. They were dull in the dim light, but Silas knew that color. He'd seen men kill their brothers for a thumb-sized nugget of it. It was gold. The town's missing gold. The shipment that had vanished from the Wells Fargo office in Red Rock 3 weeks ago. Thousands of dollars worth of bullion. strapped to the legs of a girl who couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. She wasn't just a refugee. She was a vault. The silence in the cabin grew heavy, thick enough to choke on. Silas stared at the gold, then at the girl. Her name was Clara, or so she told her between sobs as he began the grim work of removing the weights. He had to be careful. The leather straps had been on so long, they were becoming part of her. He used the knife to slice through the thongs, one by one. As each bar fell away, it hit the wooden table with a heavy final thud. 10 bars in total. Each one was stamped with the seal of the Territorial Bank. "They made me do it," Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The sheriff and Miller, the banker, they didn't want to move it in a wagon. Too many outlaws. Too many eyes. So they found me, said I was just a stray, said nobody would ever look under the skirt of a poor, sick girl. Silas felt a heat rising in his chest that had nothing to do with the Nevada sun. It was a slow, bubbling rage. He'd known Miller, a man with a greasy mustache and a gold watch chain who always talked about the sanctity of the law. "They sold it to you," Silas muttered, his hand shaking slightly as he cleaned the deep, purple grooves in her legs. "They told me if I stopped walking, they'd find me," she said. "I walked for 3 days. I couldn't stand the wait anymore. I crawled the last 5 miles. Silas worked in silence for the next hour. He boiled herbs to fight the fever. He wrapped her legs in clean linen, smelling of the lavender he kept in the trunk. He fed her a bit of broth, watching the color slowly return to her hollow cheeks. But even as he worked, his ears were pricked. He was listening to the wind. Gold like that doesn't stay missing. Men like Miller and the sheriff. Later that night, Clara fell into a fitful sleep. Silas sat at the table, the 10 gold bars lined up in front of him. They looked like teeth pulled from a monster. He could take them. He could saddle his horse, leave the girl, and be in Mexico before the sun hit the peaks. He could buy a ranch 10 times this size. He could forget the war, forget the regrets, forget the weight of being a good man in a bad world. He looked at the gold. Then he looked at the girl on the cot, her small frame shivering under his old wool blanket. He stood up, walked to the corner, and picked up his Winchester. He began to clean it. He didn't need the gold. He needed to be able to look at himself in the mirror when the sun came up. If you're still here with Silas in that cabin, listening for the sound of hooves in the dark, then you know that out here, a man's character isn't measured by what he has, but by what he's willing to protect. If this story is hitting home, go ahead and tap that like button. It tells the algorithm that real, grit-filled stories still matter. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe and ring that bell. We got a lot more miles to cover in the Old West, and the real fight for Clara's life is just about to begin. Now, pour yourself a fresh cup of coffee, and let's get back to the canyon. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. When the sound finally came, Silas heard from a mile off, the rhythmic thrum-thrum of horses being pushed hard. Not 1, 3, maybe 4. They weren't hiding. They were coming with the confidence of men who wore badges and carried the law in their holsters like a weapon. Silas moved Clara. He didn't wake her, just lifted her gently and slid her into the hidey hole, a small space beneath the floorboards where he kept his winter potatoes. "Stay quiet," he whispered as her eyes fluttered open in terror. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." He replaced the boards and pulled the heavy braided rug over the top. Then he blew out the lantern. The cabin plunged into a thick, velvet darkness. Silas sat in his rocking chair, the Winchester across his lap. He didn't wait inside. He waited on the porch. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to know that the door was closed. The riders pulled up just outside the circle of the hitching post. "Evening, Silas," the sheriff called out. His voice was smooth, like oil on a whetstone. "A bit late for a porch sit, isn't it?" "Night's the only time it's quiet enough to think, Vance," Silas replied. He didn't stand up. He just sat there, the chair creaking rhythmically. Creak, crack, creak, crack. "We're looking for something, Silas." Miller stepped forward, his horse skittish. "A piece of property. Stolen from the bank. A girl was seen heading this way." "Lots of things head this way," Silas said. "Mostly coyotes and wind. Neither of them carry much property. Vance leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Don't play the hermit with me, Silas. We followed the blood. We followed the tracks. We know she's in there. And we know what she's carrying. If you know what she's carrying, Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, then you know what you did to her. You know you treated a human being like a leather saddlebag. That doesn't sit right with me. Vance's face hardened. The mask of the law was slipping, revealing the predator underneath. What sits right with you doesn't matter. That gold belongs to the people of Red Rock. It's the town's future. The town's future sewed into a girl's legs? Silas stood up then. The rocking chair stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that comes right before a lightning strike. I don't think so, Vance. I think that gold is for a boat to San Francisco and a life where nobody knows your names. I think you're just thieves with better tailoring. Miller let out a high, nervous laugh. You're one man, Silas. An old man at that. Step aside. We take the girl, we take the gold, and you go back to your dirt. Silas raised the Winchester. He didn't aim it yet, but the barrel was a dark, certain finger pointing at the sheriff's heart. I've spent my life taking orders from men who weren't worth the boots they stood in, Silas said. I'm done with that. The girl stays. The gold stays. You riders, you have about 10 seconds to turn those horses around before I start making widows. Vance didn't flinch. He was a man who had been killed before. Deputy, the next one goes between your eyes, Vance. Silas roared. Kill him. Miller screamed, his voice cracking. Kill him and get the gold. But the deputies weren't so sure anymore. They were looking at Silas's eyes. They saw a man who had seen the trenches of Tennessee. They saw a man who had nothing left to lose. Vance pulled his horse back, his hand hovering over his coat. He looked at Silas, then at the cabin. He knew he could probably take the old man, but at least 2 of them would go down with him. This ain't over, Silas. Vance spat. You can't keep her forever. We'll come back with 20 men. We'll burn this cabin to the ground with both of you inside. Then I'll see you in the smoke, Silas said. Vance glared at him for a long, hateful minute. Then, with a sharp jerk of the reins, he turned his horse. Let's go. We'll get the boys from town. The riders disappeared into the night, the sound of their retreat echoing off the canyon walls. Silas didn't move. He stood on that porch until the dust settled. He stood there until his heart slowed down to a steady, heavy beat. He knew they were right. They would be back. The law, even the corrupt kind, has a long reach. Silas went back inside and pulled Clara from the floor. She was shaking, her eyes wide with terror. They're gone, he said. For now. He sat her back at the table. He looked at the gold bars again. They were beautiful in a cold, murderous way. What are we going to do? Clara asked. They'll kill you for this. Gold is a funny thing, Silas said. It only has value if people believe in it. And right now, it's just a weight. It's the weight that broke your legs. And it's the weight that's going to break this town if we let those men keep it. He spent the rest of the night working. He didn't pack his bags. He didn't prepare to run. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and honey, Silas saddled his horse. He put Clara on the back, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. They didn't head for Mexico. They headed for the one place Vance and Miller wouldn't expect. They headed for the state capital, 3 days' ride to the north. Silas knew a man there, a judge he'd served with in the 3rd Cavalry, a man who still believed that a badge meant something. The journey was hard. Clara's fever came and went. They hid in the draws during the day and rode during the cool of the night. Every time they saw dust on the horizon, Silas gripped his rifle, his eyes scanning the sagebrush for the glint of a sheriff's star. But they made it when they walked into the judge's office. Silas didn't say a word. He just opened his saddlebag and dumped the 10 lumps of gold onto the mahogany desk. This belongs to the people of Red Rock, Silas said, and the men who tried to steal it are currently wearing badges in that town. They used this girl as a mule. They sewed it to her skin. The judge looked at the gold. He looked at Clara, who was leaning heavily on a cane Silas had carved for her. He looked at Silas's weathered face. You realize, the judge said quietly, that you're admitting to resisting arrest and assaulting a peace officer. I'm admitting to doing what was right, Silas said. The rest is just paperwork. The law moved slowly, but it moved certain. A week later, a company of U.S. Marshals rode into Red Rock. They didn't find Vance or Miller. The cowards had smelled the wind changing and bolted 2 days prior. But the gold was returned. The bank was saved. And Silas? He didn't want a reward. He didn't want a parade. He just wanted to go back to his cabin and listen to the silence. But he didn't go back alone. Clara stayed at the ranch. Her legs healed, though she'd always walk with a slight limp. A reminder. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the mountains, Clara looked at Silas. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "You could have had $1 million. You could have been anywhere else." Silas watched the hawk circling in the thermal vents. He thought about the men he'd seen die for nothing. He thought about the weight of gold versus the weight of a soul. "Out here, Clara," Silas said, his voice soft. "The only thing you really own is your word. And mine said, I wouldn't let you fall. Gold is easy to find. A reason to stand your ground? That's the real treasure." He reached out and patted her hand. For the first time in 30 years, Silas Thorne didn't feel the weight of his memories. He just felt the warmth of the sun. "So, let me ask you something. If you were sitting on that porch, and you saw that gold, and you knew the sheriff was coming, what would you have done? Would you have taken the money and run? Or would you have stood with Silas? There's a lot of folks who think the Old West was just about outlaws and gunfights. But I think it was about the choices we make when nobody's watching. It was about the strength it takes to protect someone who can't protect themselves. If this